Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling, well, a really pivotal moment. We've got a fascinating stack of sources here, all focused on leadership strategy right after the Hijra. We're looking at how Prophet Muhammad's leadership expanded its vision, moving from a local, regional thing into a truly global mission.
It really is a study in rapid scaling, you could say. For you, the listener, we're diving into that foundational decade right after the community set up in Medina. And the sources, they give us this quite rigorous analysis of how the leadership shifted its strategic scope.
Yeah, from managing a small city-state, dealing with local tribal stuff.
Exactly, to formally engaging the superpowers of the 7th century world, the Byzantines, the Persians.
That shift, I mean, the scope of it is just breathtaking, isn't it? We're talking just 10 years, a decade where the whole geopolitical focus swings from, say, mediating between two tribes in Arabia to actually challenging the legitimacy of these massive established empires. So the core question we're really trying to unpack today is, how did this happen? What were the specific diplomatic tools used? And maybe crucially, what role did mercy play in all this? Was it just, a nice sentiment? Or was it actual functional foreign policy, a tool of statecraft?
That's the vital distinction we need to make. The big picture nugget, if you like, is that this wasn't just growth, it was a systemic transformation. It wasn't about grabbing more land, it was about transforming the very principles of governance. We're looking at how a new system, rooted in universal ideals, replaced one based on, well, limited local concerns, and how that universal framework made global expansion not just possible, but you could argue strategically necessary.
Okay, let's start right there with that initial transformation. Because the speed, as you said, is the first incredible thing. The sources all confirm. Within just 10 years of the Hijra that moved to Medina, the message expanded dramatically, way beyond Arabia.
And that kind of expansion, that rate, it needs more explanation than just, say, military victories. The sources argue pretty compellingly, I think, that this scale was possible because the vision was intentionally global from the very beginning. It suggests that great change, even if you execute it locally first, has to be conceived universally. The Prophet consciously refused to box the mission in, not just for specific tribes, not just local politics in Mecca or wherever.
Right. Okay, let's unpack the leadership lesson there. Because, if you're leading something today, the pressure is always immediate. Solve this problem, satisfy these stakeholders, secure this area. Yet the source here is saying, no, great leaders have to deliberately push their vision beyond the local, out towards the universal. How did that actually work in practice back then in Medina?
Well, it really centers on what you might call the scalability of principle. See, local vision tends to be transactional. It depends on immediate loyalties, blood ties maybe, and those things are inherently limiting. If your idea of justice only covers your family or your tribe, well, it can't really govern a diverse city, let alone a global community. So the shift meant systematically replacing those narrow tribal concerns with universal laws, principles that applied to everyone.
Can we get a bit more specific on those principles? What were these universal concepts that let the message scale across different cultures, different places, contrasting them with that restrictive sort of tit-for-tat nature of tribal law?
Sure. Tribal law often was about vengeance cycles, right? Blood money, justice based purely on who your ancestors were, very selective. The transformation involved introducing codified principles, things like the sanctity of all life and property, a standardized way to handle contracts, governance based on consultation, shura, not just inherited power. This standardized ethical and legal framework, it meant that when the message got to a new town or even a foreign court, people weren't just meeting another Arab tribe with their own customs. They were encountering a system of ethics and governance that claimed to be universally applicable. That universal architecture is what made the vision, well, exportable.
Ah, I see. So that structural change moving from loyalty based on kinship to loyalty based on shared principles that becomes the engine for global reach. But the sources also point out this wasn't just a philosophical idea floating around. There was serious groundwork, preparation, before the global outreach started.
Oh, absolutely. The vision needed execution. You can't just decide, let's go global and send any old person out with a message. Before engaging, say, the Byzantine emperor or the Persian king, these empires had centuries of complex diplomatic tradition. Remember, the Prophet prepared his companions, trained them specifically to be ambassadors. These individuals, they had to represent not just the words of the message, but the actual principles, the conduct, the ethos of this new state emerging in Medina.
We should probably define that resulting structure a bit more clearly then. This preparation, it set up a global model right from the outset. It led to what the sources call this unity of values combined with the diversity of nations. which ultimately creates the global community, the Ummah.
Yes, and when we talk about the Ummah, it's really crucial to grasp it as a kind of socio-political innovation for its time. It represented a community bound by shared faith and universal values, explicitly not by ethnicity or geography or tribal background, a truly transnational idea. It fundamentally broke that age-old pattern of organizing society based purely on inherited identity. And this foundational step, the training, it just shows that effective diplomacy needs that investment in credible, well-prepared messengers, people who can embody and articulate the values across complex global lines. It was a move from just relying on local go-betweens to building a systematic, institutionally sound way to represent the community.
Okay, so this systematic preparation then flows directly into action, what the sources are calling the diplomatic offensive. The decision to actually send these letters that marks the formal, you could say irreversible, shift to global engagement. This wasn't just networking. This was formal strategic communication with the world's biggest players, announcing their existence on the world stage, essentially as equals.
It was an act of, well, audacious confidence, profound confidence, really. To fully get it, you have to picture the geopolitical scene. The world was basically dominated by these two giants. The Byzantine Empire in the west, the Sasanian Persian Empire in the east, sophisticated centralized states. And they tended to view everyone else as either, barbarians or potential vassals, subjects. So by sending formal diplomatic communications, the Prophet was treating this fledgling city-state of Medina as an absolute equal to these huge powers, demanding their attention, their respect. That alone fundamentally reframes the whole mission. It's not just a regional skirmish anymore. It's a universal ideological invitation.
And who actually got these, frankly, astonishing letters? The sources list the absolute heavy hitters, the rulers who basically drew the map of the world back then. We're talking Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, fresh off defeating the Persians at the peak of his power. Khosrow II, the king of kings in Persia. The Nagus, the powerful king of Abyssinia, over across the Red Sea. And others too, right? Across Arabia and the Levant. It wasn't just one or two feelers. It was this widespread, simultaneous effort targeting the known centers of global power.
Right. The simultaneous nature really underscores that this was a coordinated foreign policy initiative, not just testing the waters. It was the formal kickoff of global communication, engaging the entire established world order all at once. And we should maybe pause there for a second, just to appreciate the human element. Imagine being the messenger, representing this new small community, walking into the throne room of the King of Kings, holding a document that fundamentally challenges his claim to absolute, maybe even divine, authority. That moment itself is just history-changing.
That is a powerful image. But given that huge difference in power, this wasn't just audacious, it must have felt militarily risky, surely. So how do the sources describe the message itself? If you're going to challenge the world's power structures like that, the message has to be impeccably crafted. What were the core principles laid out in those letters?
Yeah, the letters had a tough job. They had to maintain dignity for the messenger and clearly state the mission's non-negotiables. The sources outlined 3 consistent core principles, all rooted in that universal vision we talked about. First, the invitation to recognize and worship the one God, Allah, alone, monotheism, straightforward. Second, a direct invitation to accept Islam. And third, crucially, a mandate, a requirement that the rulers receiving the letter should ensure justice within their own lands.
Ah, that connection again, between the spiritual invitation and the political demand for justice. That's where the universal scalability really clicks back in. So the key insight, it seems, is that these invitations were always respectful, dignified in tone, acknowledging the ruler's status, yet at the same time, they were entirely principle-based. No watering down the core message to soothe an ego or for political convenience.
Exactly. The sources actually define this approach as a model of true diplomacy, clarity without compromise. The principles, the call to monotheism, the demand for justice, they were crystal clear, non-negotiable. But the delivery mechanism, the letter itself, maintained the utmost respect, dignity. It deliberately avoided arrogance or threats or trying to humiliate the ruler, even when addressing rulers who, frankly, could have crushed Medina easily. The objective wasn't provocation, it was a transmission of truth.
So treat the relationship with dignity, but hold firm on the message itself. That's a really powerful diplomatic model, adherence to principle without needlessly antagonizing the recipient. Okay, so we've got the audacity, the clarity of the message. But sending a bold letter like that to Khosrow, it takes more than just confidence. What was the insurance policy? What protected this diplomacy from just being swatted away? And that's where the sources bring in mercy. Shifting gears a bit to this underlying framework, The sources really emphasize that mercy wasn't just like an optional extra virtue. It was the foundational core principle of the Prophet's foreign policy, even towards hostile rulers.
Yes, this is where we move from just strategy to the core ideology. The policy was fundamentally built on mercy, rahmah, not on power projection or trying to coerce people. And the theological anchor for this is profound. It governs everything that follows. The Quran states, "We have not sent you a Muhammad except as a mercy to the worlds." That's Surah Al-Anbiya, verse 1 or 7. That verse essentially acts as the governing statute for the entire foreign relations approach.
Wow. So the leader's mandate, the whole reason for their existence in this context, is rooted in extending mercy globally. If that's your starting point, then every negotiation, every letter has to ultimately serve that purpose of mercy.
It ensures internal consistency, doesn't it? This principle dictated avoiding arrogance, insisting on dignity for everyone involved, and a commitment to seeking peaceful resolutions whenever possible. Mercy, in this context, dictated the tone, the approach, and critically, the long-term vision, the endgame of the whole movement.
But I have to ask the obvious question here. The sources call it a policy of mercy, but wasn't it also just fundamentally pragmatic? I mean, kind of a necessity when you're the weaker party militarily.
Yeah.
How do the sources convince us this was truly principled mercy and not just, strategically avoiding a fight you couldn't win?
That's the essential nuance. You're right, we have to address that. The sources argue it went beyond just pragmatism, because the policy was maintained even later, when the military balance started to shift, and it was maintained even when dealing with those who showed absolutely zero mercy towards the Muslims. If it were purely pragmatism, just weakness avoidance, you'd expect the policy to change the moment military advantage was gained, right? Instead, pursuing mercy built up long-term relational assets, a reputation for fairness, for compassion. Think about it. Force might secure territory quickly, but mercy, over time, secures allegiance, loyalty. It proactively showed a different, maybe superior alternative to the dominant ways of governing back then, which relied so heavily on imperial might and constant war.
Okay, so mercy is presented as this power to win hearts and minds across borders. It shifts mercy from being just a passive feeling to an active, powerful strategy designed for long-term relational success. Let's look at this mercy in practice then, especially when it comes to conflict. The sources stress that war was only ever a last resort. Never the first option, never the primary tool.
Absolutely. The policy was always to exhaust every diplomatic channel rooted in mercy before even considering conflict. And the most dramatic illustration of this, the one the source material really highlights as critical, is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. That's seen as the defining demonstration of this strategic principle in action.
Right, Hudaybiyah. We definitely need to spend some time on this, because that treaty, even in many historical accounts, it's often seen as, initially at least, a diplomatic setback for the Muslims. The terms seemed so harsh at the time. Can you walk us through those terms and explain how accepting them actually turned into this massive strategic strength later on?
Sure. The terms were, on the surface, quite severe, seemingly humiliating even. First, the Muslims, who had traveled all the way for pilgrimage, were denied entry to Mecca. They had to turn back to Medina without performing it. Huge disappointment. Second, a 10-year truce was agreed, which sounds okay, but then third, and this was the really difficult part for many Muslims at the time, any Meccan who fled to Medina and embraced Islam had to be returned to Mecca, handed back. But conversely, if anyone fled from Medina to Mecca, they were not returned. It just seemed deeply unfair, totally imbalanced.
The immediate sense of humiliation must have been intense, especially having to return new converts back to their persecutors. So how does accepting that demonstrate strategic strength, not weakness?
It demonstrates the strength of patience and focus on the long game. By accepting those terms, the leadership prioritized peace, stopping the hostilities over immediate symbolic victories or material gains. That 10-year truce, it established a recognized non-aggressive relationship with Mecca, their main opponent, for the very first time. That was huge. And crucially, that period of peace allowed the message itself to spread. Through safe travel, through interaction, people could actually meet Muslims, talk to them, hear the message directly, without the constant fear of fighting breaking out.
Ah, okay. So the apparent diplomatic loss was actually an informational win. By taking the hit on the terms, the leadership proved they were genuinely committed to peace. It sort of dismantled the Meccan propaganda that the Muslims were just these warmongering revolutionaries out for conquest.
Exactly. The patience, which stemmed from that core policy of mercy, it neutralized the enemy's main arguments, their fear-mongering. And what happened in the 2 years following the truce, before it was broken by the Meccans? An absolutely explosive rate of conversions and acceptance of Islam. Far more people came to Islam in those 2 years of peace than in the entire previous 18 years combined. The long-term success of the mission really hinged on that strategic patience. It proved that mercy isn't weakness, it's strategic strength. A system built purely on force might grab land quickly, sure, but a system built on patience and mercy achieves a much deeper, more sustainable ethical transformation in people's hearts and minds.
So when we link this policy back to the global outcomes, the sources seem really clear. Successfully spreading a universal message needs mercy-based policies. It's a fundamental contrast to historical systems built on domination, which almost always breed resentment and cycles of conflict down the line. Mercy ensures that when influence is eventually gained, it's a victory of principles that actually stick, not just a temporary territorial win.
That's the core argument, yes.
Okay, let's turn to the broad strategic outcomes then of this global diplomatic offensive. They sent these clear, principled letters to the emperors and kings. What happened? What are the tangible responses?
Well, as you'd expect with any global outreach, the responses were diverse, varied quite a bit. Some rulers, like the Negus of Abyssinia, are documented as embracing the message, or at least being very favorable towards it, which solidified a really key early relationship across the Red Sea. That offered potential sanctuary, trade access, a clear diplomatic win. Others, like Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, the sources suggest he showed interest, maybe even respect, treated the envoy well, but ultimately resisted the invitation, probably for complex political or strategic reasons within his own empire.
And then there was Khosrow of Persia. The sources paint a pretty dramatic picture there. He didn't just reject the letter, did he? He supposedly ripped it up, reacted with fury, and even sent a message back demanding the prophet's capture. I mean, that's the ultimate rejection, is it? A sign of extreme hostility, complete arrogance towards this fledgling state.
That reaction, extreme as it was, brings us to what the sources call the unexpected win of the diplomatic offensive. They note that even rejection, especially a violent, arrogant rejection from a superpower like Khosrow, still became global publicity for the mission, for its ideals. Think about it. When the King of Kings, the ruler of Persia, reacts that strongly, that violently, to a mere letter from some, until then, relatively obscure Arabian leader, well, it actually validates the importance of the message being delivered. It makes people ask, what's in that letter that got him so riled up?
That is fascinating. So the very act of aggressive rejection inadvertently amplified the message, made it more significant. But how can the sources really frame that as a strategic win, especially when you're dealing with a monolithic, hostile empire like Persia at that time?
Because the immediate goal wasn't necessarily compliance from everyone. The deeper goal was the ethical positioning of this new movement against the existing world order. Khosrow's arrogance, his violent reaction, it stood in stark contrast to the dignity, the clarity, the respect inherent in the original invitation he received. And when the Persian Empire itself started to crumble not long after, partly due to internal chaos, exhaustion from those long wars with Byzantium, that original diplomatic exchange, that contrast was remembered. The leadership in Medina had already planted the seed of moral authority. Khosrow's rejection, in a way, just fertilized the ground for future acceptance by highlighting the difference in approach.
Right. So the leadership lesson there is about profound patience again, and vision. It's about planting ethical seeds, clearly articulating your vision, and trusting that the principles will eventually resonate. Even if the tangible results, the fruits, only appear much later. The main job is to get the vision out there, clearly and with dignity, not necessarily to force immediate agreement from everyone.
Precisely. And it's this long-term ethical positioning that leads the sources to draw parallels with modern concepts like ethical branding and diplomacy.
Ethical branding, I like applying that term back here. It fits. The consistency, the dignity of the message maintained, whether talking to the friendly Negus or the hostile Khosrow, it created this definitive global brand image for the movement. Even those rulers who resisted, they couldn't really deny the clarity of the message or its commitment to those core principles: monotheism, justice.
That brand consistency is absolutely paramount. The message itself didn't change based on who the audience was or how powerful they were. This meant the principles themselves became the defining feature, independent of shifting politics or the threat of force. The leadership was essentially selling a system of values, not just trying to make a transactional deal.
Okay, now let's really bring this home into our current age, as the sources encourage us to. What does this model of communication mean for us, for you, the listener, today? In our tech-driven, globalized world, the source specifically mentions applying this to the AI era. How does that work?
Yeah, The sources make a powerful, very direct parallel here. They argue that the prophet's physical letters carried by messengers risking their lives over vast, dangerous distances are functionally equivalent to our digital letters today. Think social media posts, global online platforms, even AI-driven communication systems that can transmit messages to billions, almost instantly. The speed is incomparable, but the core principle of transmitting a value set remains identical.
So the challenge isn't the technology, the medium, whether it's ink on parchment or bits in a fiber optic cable, but the ethical foundation of the message itself.
Exactly that. The source insists that in this AI age, these incredibly powerful, pervasive global platforms must still carry messages rooted in mercy and truth. If the speed and reach of communication go up exponentially, then the ethical foundation of that communication, its dignity, its clarity, its consistency, needs to be proportionally stronger, much stronger. If we fail to root our digital diplomacy, our global communication, in mercy, then these platforms just end up amplifying noise or fear or division instead of promoting shared universal values.
So if those original diplomatic letters were meant to establish a universal standard, God's oneness, justice, the citation, then our digital letters today have a similar weight. They need to adhere to a universal standard of mercy, fight misinformation, uphold truth with dignity, and do that regardless of who we perceive the recipient to be, how powerful or hostile they seem online.
That's the core challenge laid out today, yes. The final conclusion drawn from the source material is really this. The central test for global leadership now is whether it can rediscover mercy and implement it as actual governing policy, as an active, measurable, strategic tool, instead of just relying on the old systems of force or economic dominance or now maybe technological manipulation. That historical model, it provides a complete, surprisingly scalable template for how to engage ethically on a global scale.
Wow. This deep dive has really offered a profound look at how foundational values can become the very tools of global strategy. We started by seeing that incredible shift, didn't we? From a local influence in Medina, blossoming into a global center of influence within just one critical decade.
And we saw how those letters, sent out to the world rulers, they really serve as this timeless model for ethical diplomacy. Diplomacy that has to be principle-based, absolutely dignified in its tone, and utterly clear in its core message, maintaining that consistency no matter who you're talking to.
And ultimately, it's the policy of mercy that provides the strategic bedrock. We saw that so vividly with Hudaybiyah. Mercy builds the bridges that force just ends up destroying. It's the long-term play. Ensuring that influence, when it comes, is founded on values that last, that are sustainable, not just on fleeting military power.
And this knowledge, it really is actionable. So we want to leave you, the listener, with some reflections drawn straight from these sources, encouraging you to think about how to integrate this kind of strategic approach into your own areas of influence, whether they're big or small.
Okay, first, a thought about values. If you were writing your own letter of values today, maybe for your company, your community group, your online platform, what are the 3 core, non-negotiable principles you'd invite the world to uphold? Think about being specific, uncompromising on the principle, but still dignified in the tone.
Second, a thought about practice. Think about your own professional diplomacy. Your daily communications, those emails you send, the meetings you're in, negotiations, even conflicts you handle. Do your personal policies or your organization's policies actually reflect those principles of mercy, patience, dignity, clarity? Or do they sometimes reflect ego, maybe? Or the need for a quick win, a short-term gain, a kind of transactional dominance?
And finally, here's a provocative thought to maybe mull over. As we dive deeper into this AI era, where communication is instant, global, and can be used for, well, deep manipulation, the demand for truly ethical, principled global leadership is just immense, paramount. So consider this. How could using those digital letters, our modern communication tools, but infusing them with those historical principles of dignity, clarity, and universal mercy, how could that fundamentally revolutionize international negotiation, global communication? Could it achieve things in ways that just relying on force or economic pressure or sheer technological speed never ever could?